Okay, hi, my name is Stephanie Goulet, and this is take 2 of my Learning Disabilities Workshop presentation. Once again, I was not able to do this in front of an audience of any kind due to the working to rule legislations that are put in place right now. If I had a bigger timeline, I would definitely be able to execute this, and I'm hoping to do so in the near future. Okay, so for the purpose of this presentation, my name is Stephanie Goulet. I am currently working as a psychometrist for the Rainbow District School Board. I did my undergrad here at Laurentian in psychology. I also did a Master's of Teaching at Griffith University for primary school age children. The purpose of this presentation is to better understand what a learning disability is and how it would be applied to the local school board. So to begin, I would again start off with an icebreaker, a very quick one, to better get to know who is in the workshop and for them to feel more comfortable interacting with each other. So I would start by asking everyone to think of one word that would best describe learning. Based on the size of the group, we could do this individually, we can do this as a whole group, we can do this in small groups. I would then ask everyone we would document those words. So here I have these fancy smartboard markers so we can write them directly onto the slide. We can either use a chalkboard, a whiteboard, or some grid paper. Okay, and I would keep that up until the end of the presentation. So what we're going to do today is we're going to learn have a better understanding of what is a learning disability, how it affects the child or the student, as well as what an individual education plan is and how that is put in place to help the students. Okay, so to start off and to kick off the presentation, I would like to share this quote that many children struggle in school because it's the way they're being taught is incompatible with the way they learn. I think this is a really important way to kick off the presentation to give a really good understanding that how teaching is influencing learning, okay, how the child is learning and not whether or not they can learn. So I should mention one thing I would do differently in this presentation than the previous one is I would have a handout for everyone. I would print off the slides with a section for note-taking for a few different reasons to allow maybe if there's some visual difficulties, they can see and follow along right on the sheet, or if they want to take some notes, write down questions so that we can address it later. I think having the visual aid right in front of you might better help them follow along with the presentation. Okay, so research has shown that no two children are alike. No two children learn in the exact same way. So one environment that is enriched for learning for one may not be for the other. And so in a classroom, children should be encouraged and taught to the way they think and not asked to conform to one way of thinking, to chalk and talk teaching. Okay, so this graph is really interesting that 80% of students are successful in a regular classroom with regular classroom instruction, whereas 20% would need additional specific instruction in order to be successful, in order to achieve at the same level. So what I want you to take away from these slides is that learning is an individualized process. And classrooms have such a wide range of students, especially today, different thinking levels, different thinking abilities. There's no cookie cutter way of learning and therefore no cookie cutter way of teaching. I think it's also important to note that a learning disability means that you can learn, you just learn differently, as opposed to you're disabled in learning, you can't learn. So it should be taken away that learning disability means you just learn differently. Okay, so this is also a different slide than was presented in the first presentation. I think it's a really good way to better understand what I'm going to talk about next. So this is a slide, I'm not sure if you can see it, of what the standard scores are. So I'd first explain, based on the normal curve, we're going to talk about the normal curve next. If they have this slide on their pieces of paper, I think they'll have a better understanding of what I'm trying to say. The green, the average range, ranges from 90 to 105, and the standard score, 110, sorry. Then there's above average, well above average, very high, as well leading up to very low. And this is what this school board uses in order to identify students. Okay, it'll make more sense in a second. So this is the normal curve. when we do a psychoeducational assessment, we look at a bunch of different areas of learning, and then we standardize them. It's standardized for a score. So 50% of the population has an ability in the average range. So as we saw in the previous slide, 90 to 110 is average, 50% of the students. Now 5% of the students have a standard score of 75 or below, which is down here. Achieving scores when speaking about intellect, achieving scores of 75 or below would allow them to meet the criteria to be identified as a student with either a mild intellectual disability, MID, which is an educational identification, or a developmental disability, DD, which is also an educational identification. However, it also qualifies to apply for a pension of some sort later on in life. Receiving these identifications would help students be placed in an intensive support program where they would receive targeted supports for their abilities. They would not necessarily succeed in full integration in a regular classroom. Okay. On the other end of the scale, we have 2% of the population have a standard score of 130 or higher. And that's the gifted range. So it would be complete opposite end from where we were the first time. So again, gifted would be another identification within the school board, an educational identification. So in order to qualify to meet the criteria to be identified with a learning disability, the students have to have average to above average intellect, which would be anywhere from here on, as well as areas of deficit that would fall on this end of the spectrum. Okay. So what does that mean exactly? So areas of deficit are the way they think and reason using language without using language. So perceiving information, thinking and reasoning verbally, being able to use language to answer questions, or non-verbally, for example, manipulating with blocks, pictures, patterns, where the language piece is taken away. Remembering would be another processing area, so that can be working memory, where they have to manipulate in their head and give back a response. So for example, if we are in class and I'm asking you what 5 plus 5 is, so the student has to first remember what the number 5 is, has to remember what addition means. They have to take that information, process it, do the addition, and then give you a response. So that's working memory. They have to manipulate it in their head. It can also be simple visual memory, looking at some pictures and remembering what it is without doing a manipulation. It could be being told a story or some instructions, having to remember them step by step. It could be meaningful or not. For example, some students might have a really hard time to remember a story, but if you tailored it to something they like, for example, Frozen, which is something we see a lot, if we incorporate Elsa and Let It Snow, they're able to remember that a lot more because it's meaningful to them. They can relate to it. Okay, so other examples are phonological awareness, their basic reading skills, processing speed, how quickly they're able to answer questions. Sometimes it just takes students longer, and that would be an area of deficit for them, impacting their academics. Okay, so like I just said, the areas of deficit, phonological awareness, memory, processing speed, would have to impact their academics in some way in order for it to be qualified as a learning disability. So this can be reading, decoding, being able to sound out the letter sounds, reading comprehension, can they understand what they're reading? It could be writing, such as spelling, the actual mechanics of writing. Sometimes there's a fine motor difficulty that can affect that. It can be also putting their thoughts onto paper, organizing their thoughts in their head, and putting a response down physically onto paper. Oral communication, so expressive language, how well they're able to express themselves, or receptive language, how well they understand language that is being said to them. Mathematics, so there are two different streams here where we can say that basic math facts, they get a page of math and how quickly they're able to answer those questions, as well as if they're able to use a type of manipulative, if they're presented with a graph, a chart, a picture, something they're able to visually see the math problem. Sometimes one works better for the other, works better than the other. Okay? So again, we're back at the standard scores. I have this up to refresh everyone's memory, and it as well so that it is presented on the sheet before going over to the next slide. Okay, so here is a graph, what you would typically see if we sent home a report after doing a psychoeducational assessment. This is a graph of a student who was identified with a learning disability. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through it. It's a little bit tricky to see on here, but I'm going to do my best. Okay, so the student, every point on this graph represents a score or a result that was taken from testing that was completed with the student. All right, so before the dotted line, we have scores that represent intellect. As we can see, what I should start with, the blue bar here is the average range. It's where we would expect a typical student of that age to fall in most of the time. So as we can see, on the side of the intellect, it falls in the average range. So that ticks off the first box. In order to receive a learning disability, you must have average to above average intellect. In between the two bars are processes that would affect learning. So everything that we discussed where a student might have a deficit. So for example, working memory is in the average range. Immediate verbal memory, so being able to recall parts of a story that was just said to them, average range. Visual memory for design. So that one in particular is visual memory for something that is not meaningful. In this case, it was just basic geographic shapes. It is not in the average range. That is an area of deficit for that student. Whereas a picture, something more meaningful, something that they can relate to, is in the average range. So that's important to note that this student would require their visual, the stimuli to be presented to them in something that's meaningful. They'll better be able to remember it. Processing speed, average range. They're able to process information as would a regular student their age. The next couple of scores are the basics of reading. So this student has a deficit in phonological awareness, being able to letter sounds, just those basic components of reading. Okay, so everything after the solid line are academic areas. So what we wanted to do is compare their intellect with their processes to see how it affects their academics. So in this case, we have to make note of the basics of reading. The first grouping of scores, if you were better able to see in green, are the reading skills. So the student was asked to do a few different reading tasks, and as we can see, they all fall below the average range. It's not a shock because we can see that their basic skills of reading are negatively impacting their reading abilities. Okay? The next grouping of scores are writing skills. So you're asked to do a few different writing tasks, and again, much below the average range. So if we think about it, if the student doesn't have those basic skills of reading, they're having a difficult time both reading and understanding what's read. They're gonna have, it makes sense that they'll have a difficulty in the writing component. They would have a difficulty spelling, putting their thoughts onto paper, and again, it all links together. The next two scores we'll just touch on very briefly. Language, so expressive and receptive language, solidly in the average range, as well as mathematics. Both problem solving using a visual stimulus, as well as basic math facts. So both of those components are solidly in the average range. So what this means is because the student has average to above average intellect, because they have some areas of deficit in their processing, and because that's affecting reading and writing, the student would be identified as a student with a learning disability with needs of reading and writing. Okay. I would stop here because it is pretty complex, and what's up on the board is might be difficult to understand for anyone who's new to the information. I would ask if anyone has any questions at this time, or to write them down, and I will go through it one-on-one at the end of the presentation. All right, we're just flying through. It's important to note that although the areas of processing, phonological awareness, memory, processing speed do affect student learning, there are also other things that contribute to it. Things such as fears and anxieties, test anxiety, being nervous doing public presentations, or even just being called out in class, that could definitely affect students' learning and their academics. Social interactions, if the student has difficulty interacting with their peers or the teacher or being in the class setting, that would affect their academics. As well as learning skills such as responsibility, studying, organizing themselves, advocating for themselves. If they know they can't see or they can't hear, or they're able to ask the teacher to clarify that or modify that information in some way. Also self-esteem and confidence in their own abilities. Sometimes students have a hard time just getting going because they don't believe in themselves. All those types of things would affect learning, as well as their achievement. So for example, organization, maybe the student's desk is a mess, and at home it's a mess, and they lose their assignments or they never hand them in on time. That would affect their learning, and it would be demonstrated on their report cards, for example. Okay, so now we're going to move into what happened. So now my student has a learning disability. He's identified with reading and writing. So what would happen at the school level is they would be identified as having a learning disability, and they would receive an individual education plan, or an IEP. So an IEP is developed by the school with the use of the scores, so that graph would be presented, and so the psychoeducational assessment, and it would profile their strengths and needs in order to individually develop the IEP. So the term individual education plan is really important here. Once the IEP is developed and implemented, which would have a bunch of different strategies, and for that student, their success would be closely monitored and reviewed and updated throughout the educational career. Most of the time, a student would be brought forward for an assessment around grade 3 age. Between grade 3 and grade 8, a lot can happen. Sometimes the IEP will change and grow with the student as what they're learning becomes more and more complex, as well as for during transition time. So going into high school, the IEP it'd be really important to review the IEP there, as well as students are going to college, especially at Cambrian. NOARC requires a new assessment going into college. And this way we can better understand where that student is and what their needs are, but now that they've grown a bit older. Okay, so there are two types of IEPs. So there's an exceptional IEP, which means the student has been identified as an exceptional pupil. So all that means is they met the criteria for an identification. And that language is really important. The student has to meet the criteria: the average, above average intellect, the deficit in processing, and affecting academics, in order to receive a learning disability identification. And there's also a non-exceptional IEP, so the student is not identified. So that could be for a few different reasons. One, where the criteria was not met for an identification. Another one could be they haven't been seen yet. Like I said, we typically see them in grade 3 because of the age and the curriculum material that they've been exposed to. However, it might be apparent in senior kindergarten, JK, grade 1, that they need some additional support in the classroom and some modifications. So the student might be identified as a non-exceptional pupil or have a non-exceptional IEP in order for to receive this special education services to be applied to their academics. Okay? So what does an IEP do? So it provides accommodations or differentiation, different approaches to receiving information. Okay, so it basically levels off the playing field to ensure that the student is succeeding at the same level as their peers. Okay, so it's individualized, so that means case by case. There's not one umbrella IEP given to all students. Each student has their very own IEP, and it's based on their level of processing, on their academic deficits, as well as history of successful implementations. So if we know that scribing might help the student, and it's been done so in the past, we would take that into consideration. Just like if scribing has been tried in the past and it didn't work, it's really important to know those types of things. Okay, and it's also really important to understand the curriculum requirements when developing the IEP. Okay, so there are different kinds of accommodations that can be provided to the student. So for example, instructional accommodations. So maybe the student would require small group settings, small group instruction, or individualized one-on-one instruction. That could be providing assistive technology, reading of any written components of an assignment. It could be environmental. So that would be within the classroom. For example, if the student is very distractible, that could mean preferential seating, being close to the teacher. I lost my train of thought. It can mean sitting close to the teacher so that they are very able to minimize the distractions, or if they have difficulty seeing the board, it could mean that they would have to sit in the front row, as well as hearing, those types of things. An assessment accommodation would basically be how they have access to the assessment. Some students need more time. Some students need to write their assessment in a quiet, distraction-free zone. So it could be in a different room, in a different area of the classroom, or even at a different time. It could also mean having access to assistive technology. Maybe they need the assignment to be read to them, or maybe they need it to be scribed, so they need to speak into the technology to document their written work. So it's very broad and, again, very individualized. Okay, so that's the accommodation level, that we use the same curriculum requirements for that grade, they just receive additional supports. Sometimes that doesn't work. Sometimes accommodations are not enough, and that's when modifications come in. So this is where, if, for example, most students are in grade 6, they're using their curriculum standards at a grade 6 level. Now, the modification comes in where they could be achieving at different levels. So for example, the student we saw who has a learning disability in reading and writing, perhaps their curriculum will be modified to a grade 2 level, but they're in grade 6. It can also go the other way. If they are have an identification as gifted, the curriculum can be modified to a grade 7 level, and they're in a grade 6 classroom. Okay, so this is playing around with the Ontario curriculum expectations. Sometimes modifications aren't enough, and that's where alternative expectations come in. So this is completely changing the Ontario curriculum, and they do not meet the expectation standards. So an alternative expectation would be completely removing the curriculum provincial policy. And so we would focus more here on areas of life skills, orientation, mobility training, social situations. We're basically really trying to help that student be able to live in society, as opposed to focusing on math curriculum or English curriculum. Okay? So this is what an IEP would look like, and it's difficult to see on the video, but in certain areas we would be able to see their grade, if they are if they have an exceptional or non-exceptional identification, as well as here we can see that reading and writing have been accommodated. So again, that means they are learning with the Ontario curriculum, but they're receiving those additional accommodations, scribing, assistive technology, being read to, being provided written prompts as opposed to verbal ones, those types of things. Okay, and again, we can see they have a learning disability. Okay, so again, I would ask everyone to write down any questions they might have, or I can answer any questions at this time. And finally, to conclude, I would redo the icebreaker. Tell me one word that represents learning to you. And I'm hoping here we would again document it down, and I would like to compare them to see if there has been a change in their thinking about what learning means. I'm hoping to see things like individualized, case by case, not cookie cutter, that sort of thing. One thing I should have mentioned at the beginning is this workshop would be really good if parents have already received an IEP or psychoed report, and they would bring it with them. We can help one-on-one if they have any questions or they're unsure about what they're looking at. It would be a really good opportunity to better understand what they received, especially because it is so, the workshop is really tailored to this school board and what we do here and how it could help their students. Okay, and then last but not least, I would have a question period. For the question period, I would say I would like to circulate around. Sometimes, this is some information can be confidential or difficult to express out loud in front of others. They might want to keep it keep to themselves. So I would like to go around and see if anyone required additional help, and I would do that at this time. Okay. Well, thank you for listening to my presentation.